Hey everyone, Dan with Mac Rumors, and in this video we're going to take a look at the Surface Book 2 and get my thoughts and overall impressions on this laptop as a longtime Mac user, and then compare it up against its competitor, the MacBook Pro. Now normally when we do comparison videos, we like to check out a few different categories, and for this video we're going to be focusing on build quality and design, key features like the detachable display and the touch bar, and my overall impressions and final thoughts about each laptop. And before we get into our first category, I wanted to note that both of these machines are really powerful and performance is pretty similar to one another. The Surface Book 2 featured in this video is the 15-inch Core i7 model with 16 gigabytes of RAM and a GTX 1060 graphics card. The MacBook Pro is the 2016 15-inch Core i7 with 16 gigabytes of RAM and a Radeon Pro 450 graphics card. So our first category is build quality, and honestly, before Microsoft started making its own hardware, I generally found third-party Windows PCs to be nowhere near Apple's level in terms of design. The MacBook Pro has always been a stunning piece of hardware and has been well built for a few generations now. So when the original Surface Book was released, I definitely started to take note of what Microsoft was doing with their hardware, and now with devices like the Surface Studio, Surface Laptop, and this Surface Book 2, I can confidently say that Microsoft is right up there in design and build quality with Apple and could very well pass it up one day. So with that said, both machines are beautiful, and if you're looking for a stunning laptop, it's gonna be a tough choice. The Surface Book 2 does have an unusual design, however, with its fulcrum hinge that paves the way for the air gap between the display and the keyboard. There were reports of a lot of issues with the previous generation Surface Book, but I've had no issues so far with this hinge and overall build. So in terms of I/O, the Surface Book 2 has two USB Type-A ports, an SD card slot, which as a video editor is just a fantastic thing to have, one USB Type-C port, and a proprietary Surface connector for charging, although you can actually use the USB Type-C port to charge your laptop. There's also a headphone jack located at the top right of the display when the Surface Book is in laptop mode. You'll also find your power and volume buttons on top of the display as well. The MacBook Pro got rid of all ports in favor of just 4 USB Type-C ports and the 3.5mm headphone jack. Now I gotta admit, the I/O on the Surface Book 2 is much more diverse, and the SD card slot really drives it home for me. I like this setup a lot more, however, I do wish they were able to add 1 or 2 more USB Type-C ports and remove that proprietary Surface connector. The display has a beautiful 15-inch 3240 by 2160 resolution, and it's one of the best displays that I have seen on a Windows PC, but the same issue that seemingly plagues all other third-party laptops is found in the Surface Book 2, and that's the overall brightness of the display. Now don't get me wrong, this display does get pretty bright, but compared to my MacBook Pro, it's kind of not even close. I also feel like text is much more crisp and sharp on the MacBook Pro, and that overall it has just a much more quality display. Do keep in mind, however, that the Surface Book 2 has a touch display, which could be an advantage depending on your use case over the MacBook Pro. The touch display is integral to the Surface Book's 2-in-1 functionality. Finally, our last design element is the keyboard and trackpad. The MacBook Pro, with those butterfly keys, seemingly has a love-hate relationship with a lot of the general public. Now I personally love this keyboard. I love the clickiness, even though the keys do not travel as far as most traditional keyboards. I'm just a fan of the way it feels when I type. The Surface Book 2 has a much different feeling. It's more in line with standard keyboards, but it feels a bit softer to type on. I really like the keyboards on each computer, and I'm gonna have to say that it's kind of even to me. The trackpads, however, are a completely different story. I'm not a big fan of the trackpad on the Surface Book 2. It's probably because I'm spoiled by Apple's faux trackpad that vibrates when pressed to portray an actual click, even though it's not a physical button at all. I love the unnecessary size of the trackpad and the number of gestures that you can use to access specific parts of the operating system, which is why it has changed the way I interact with my trackpad and computer overall. I just can't seem to get used to the overall feel of the Surface Book's trackpad quite yet. Moving on to our next category, which is key features or selling points of each laptop, starting with the MacBook Pro's touch bar. The touch bar is a secondary AMOLED display located at the top of the keyboard, essentially replacing your physical function keys and making them into touch-based buttons. These functions change depending on what type of application or part of the operating system that you might be in. Now, I've had this laptop for about 2 years, and my use cases for the touch bar have ranged anywhere from a quick lock of my laptop, an easier way to access emojis, scrubbing through videos, and the most useful thing for me is the audio controls in Final Cut Pro, to which there really is no quick keyboard shortcut for. Now, that last point is important because for most of the touch bar functions that you might use with an app, there's probably a keyboard shortcut that you already know and that you already use. And it's just a lot faster for your fingers to not have to move up to the touch bar over entering the keyboard command. Also, when you're editing or working with your laptop docked to an external monitor, the main selling point of your device becomes literally useless. Even though I rarely use the touch bar for extra in-app shortcuts, I would like to see a Magic Keyboard with touch bar in the near future so that maybe I could start using it more on my iMac Pro. The Surface Book 2's selling point is, well, the fact that you can just detach the display from the keyboard altogether and just go full tablet mode. By pressing the detach key on the keyboard, your display can now be removed from its base, and as mentioned earlier, used as a tablet, or you can attach the display on backwards, which will bring back your dedicated GPU, since all of the real horsepower of this machine is located inside of the base. And if you have some of the key accessories like the Surface Pen or Surface Dial, creative work can be a lot easier in this mode. Speaking of the Surface Pen and Dial, these accessories are super cool for graphic designers, editors, etc. Now, I'm not much of an artist, so I find myself really only using the pen as a way to take some notes for a script or meeting. The dial is pretty useful for Photoshop work or even editing when you want to scrub through a timeline or really zoom in on an image. The dial can actually interact with your display, so if you place it directly on top, you can bring up more controls for quick access. I'm gonna have to give the edge to Microsoft on this one. I've always wanted a MacBook Pro with this same functionality, but I'm just not sure it's ever going to happen. Sure, the touch bar is a nice step into some different innovation, but until it's user customizable for pretty much all of your applications, the Surface Book's 2-in-1 feature is more useful to me and probably the average consumer. Finally, my overall impressions of the Surface Book 2 compared to the MacBook Pro have been fairly positive. There is a lot to talk about when it comes to comparing Windows to macOS, and it really does just boil down to personal preference. When it comes to deciding which laptop to buy, the answer is almost always, which operating system do you prefer? Or are you heavily invested in the Apple ecosystem, etc.? Now, I know people may see this as a cop-out by not declaring one laptop better than the other, but to me, it really does come down to what other devices do I use on a daily basis, and how does that coincide with my laptop? With an iPhone and a MacBook Pro, handoff, continuity, AirDrop, and not to mention Final Cut Pro are a big part of the way I get work done with my phone, tablet, and laptop. Even though I think the Surface Book 2 is an incredible laptop and I really love the 2-in-1 functionality, coupled with that Surface Pen and Dial accessories, the software experience is just not enough for me to switch just yet because of my reliance on Apple's ecosystem. So if you're not particularly tied down to a specific operating system, and maybe you want to try something different over a MacBook Pro, I really do think the Surface Book 2 is a really solid option. So let us know what you think of the Surface Book 2, and if this laptop has tempted you at all to maybe make the switch over to a Windows PC. Also, be sure to let us know if there is a more in-depth comparison video that you'd like to see between these two machines in the comment section down below. This has been Dan with Mac Rumors. Thanks for watching, and I will see you in the next one.